Chapter 9. Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. On the 9th of January, 4 days ago, I received by the evening a registered envelope addressed in the hand of my colleagues and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man, dined with him, indeed, the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify formality of registration. The content increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. 10th December, 18. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. There was never a day when, if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honor, my reason depend on you, I would not have sacrificed my left hand to help you. Lanyon, my life, my honor, my reason, all are at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose, after this preface, that I am going to ask you for something dishonorable to grant. Judge for yourself. I want you to postpone all other engagement for tonight. Aye, even if you were summoned to the beside of an emperor, to take a cab unless your carriage should actually be at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, to drive straight to my house. Poole, my butler, has his orders. You will find him waiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is to be forced, and you are to go in alone. To open the glazed press and letter E on the left hand, breaking the lock of it to be shut, and draw out, with all its contents as they stand, the fourth drawer from the top, or which is the same thing, the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have morbid fear of misdirecting you, but even if I am in error, you may note the right drawer by its contents. Some powders, a peel, and paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to the Cavendish Square exactly as it stands. That is the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once, the receipt of this long before midnight. But I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in fear of no one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is preferred for what will then remain to do. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in that hand the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they may appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour, in a strange place, laboring under a blackness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate. And yet, well aware of that, if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, H.J. P.S. I already sealed up this when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It is possible that the post office may fail me, and this letter does not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of that day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if that night passes without an event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Upon reading of this letter, I made sure my colleagues was insane, but till that was proved beyond the possibility of a doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance. An appeal so worded could not set aside without a grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from the table, got into a hansom, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting for my arrival. He had received by the same post as mine a registered letter of instruction, had sent at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesmen came in while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Dr. Denman's surgical theater, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet was most conveniently entered. The door was very strong, and lock excellent. The carpenter vowed he would have made great trouble and have to do much damage. If force were to be used, then the locksmith was near despair, but this was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work, the door stood open. The press marked E and was unlocked. I took out of the drawer and filled up with a straw and tied in a sheet, and returned with the Cavendish Square. Here I provided to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of dispensing chemist, so that was plain they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. When I opened the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of white color. The phial to which I next turned my attention might have been about half of a blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell and seemed to me to contain phosphorus of some volatile ether. At the other ingredients I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Here there were a brief remark and appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, doubtable, occurring perhaps 6 months in a total several hundred entries, and once very early in the list, and followed by several marks of exclamation, "Total failure!" All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me that it was definite. Here were a phial of some tincture, a paper of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments that had led, like to many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honor, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? Or if his messenger to go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? The more I reflected, the more I convinced that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease, and though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some posture of self-defense. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London. Ere the knocker sounded very gently over the door. I went myself at the summons, and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. "Are you come from Dr. Jekyll?" I asked. He told me yes, by a constrained gesture, and when I had bidden him enter, he did not obey me. Without a searching backward glance into the darkness of a square, there was a policeman not far off, advancing with a bull's eye open. At the sight, I thought my visitor started and made a greater haste. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, as I followed him into the bright light of consulting room. I kept my hand ready on my weapon. Here at last I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I had never set eyes on him before. So much was certain. He was small, as I have said. I was struck beside with a shocking expression on his face. With his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent ability of construction, and last but not least, with an odd subjective disturbance caused by his neighborhood, this bore some resemblance to incompetent rigor, and was accompanied by a marked sinking of the pulse. At the time, I set it down into some idiosyncratic personal distaste, and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms, but I have since had reason to believe to cause to lie such deeper in nature of man, and to turn on some nobler hot hinge than principal hatred. This person, who had thus, from the first moment of his entrance, struck in me what I can only describe as disgustful curiosity, was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of rich and sober fabric, were enormously too large for him in every measurement, his trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground. The waist of the coat below his haunches, the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. Strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement was far from moving me to laughter. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me, something seizing, surprising, and revolting. This fresh disparity seemed to fit it within, to reinforce it, so that to my interest in the man's nature and the character, there was added a curiosity to his origin, his life, his fortune and status in the world. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to be set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was, indeed, on fire with sober excitement. "Have you got it?" he cried. "Have you got it?" And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought me to shake. I put him back, conscious at his touch and certain icy pang along my blood. "Come, sir," said I. "You forgot that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And I showed him an example, and sat down myself in my customary seat, and as with my fair intimidation of my ordinary manner to a patient, as the lateness of the hour, the nature of my occupations, and the horror I had of the visitor would suffer to me muster. "I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon," he replied civilly enough. "What you say is very well founded, and my impatience has shown its heels to my politeness. I come here at the instance of your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business at some moment," and I understood. He paused and put his hand on his throat, and I could see, in spite of his collected manner, that he was wrestling against the approaches of the hysteria. I understood a drawer, but here I took pity on my visitor's suspense, and some perhaps on my own growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," I said, pointing to the drawer, where it lay on the floor behind the table and still covered with a sheet. He sprang to it, and then paused, and laid his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsion action of his jaws, and his face so ghastly to see that I grew alarmed both for his life and reason. "Compose yourself," I said. He turned a dreadful smile to me, as if with the direction of despair plucked away the sheet. At the sight, the content, he uttered one loud of such immense relief that I sat petrified, and the next moment, in a voice that was already fairly well under control, "Have you a graduated glass?" he asked. I rose from my place with something of an effort and gave him what he asked. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders. The mixture, which was the first reddish hue, began, in proportion as the crystals melted, to brighten in color, at first audibly, and to throw off small furrows of vapor. Suddenly, at the same moment, the ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with the air of scrutiny. "Now," he said, "to settle what remains, will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand and go forth from your house to further parley? Or has the greed of curiosity too much command for you? Think before you answer, for it shall be done as you decide. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, and neither richer nor wiser, unless the sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as kind of riches of the soul. Or, if you shall so prefer to choose, a new province of knowledge, and you knew a new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you. Here, in this room, upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan." "Sir," I said, affecting a coolness that I was far from truly possessing, "you speak enigmas, and you will perhaps not wonder that I hear you with no very strong impression of belief. But I have gone too far in the way of inexplicable services to pause before I see the end." "It is well," replied my visitor. "Lanyon, you remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of the profession, and now you have so long been bound to most narrow and material views. You have been denied the virtue of transcendental medicine. You have derided your superiors. Behold!" He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table, and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with open mouth. And as I looked there I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and his features seemed to melt and alter. And the next moment I had sprung to my feet and leaped back against the wall, my arms raised to shield me from that prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. "Oh God!" I screamed. "Oh God!" again and again, for there before my eyes, pale and shaken, and half fainting, the groping before him with his hands, like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. What he told me in the next hour I cannot bring my mind to set on paper. I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, and my soul sickened at it. And yet now when the sight has faded from my eyes, I ask myself if I believe it, and I cannot answer. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me. The deadliest terror sits by me at all hours of the day and night, and I feel that my days are numbered, and I must die. And yet I shall die incredulous. As for the moral turpitude that man unveiled to me, even with tears of penitence, I cannot, even in memory, dwell on it without the start of horror. I will say but one thing, Utterson, and that if you can bring your mind to credit it, will you be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde and hunted for in every corner of the land as the murderer of Carew. Chapter 10. Final chapter. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. I was born in the year 1869 to a large fortune, endowed besides with an excellent parts, inclined by the nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men, and thus, as we have supposed, with every guarantee of an honorable and distinguished future. And indeed the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such has made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my impetuous desire to carry on my head high and wear more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached my years of reflection and began to look around me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of me. Many a man would have even blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. It was thus rather to be exerting nature of my aspirations than my particular graduation in my faults that made me what I was, and with even deeper trench than the majority of men, served to in me those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound man's dual nature. In this case, I was driven to reflect deeply and invertedly on the hard law of life, which lies at the root of religion and is one of the most plentiful springs of distress. Though so profound and double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me were dead in earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame. Then I was labored in the eye of a day at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering, and at chance that direction of my scientific studies, which led wholly toward the mystic and transcendental, reacted and shed a strong light of this concussiousness of the perennial war among my members. With every day, from both sides of my intelligence, the moral of the intellectual, and thus I drew steadily nearer to that truth, by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. I say two, because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow, others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard the guess that man will ultimately be known for a mere polity of multifarious and the incongruous and independent denizens. I, for my part, from the nature of my life, advance infallibly in one direction and one direction only. It was on one moral side, and in that my own person, that I learned to recognize through the primitive duality of men. I saw that one of two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to either, it was only because I was radically both, and from the early dates, even before my course of my scientific discoveries had begun to suggest the most naked possibility of such a miracle, I had learned to dwell with such pleasure, as beloved daydream, on the thought of the separation of these elements. If each, I told myself, could be housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. The unjust might go his way, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin, and then just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of his extraneous evil. It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous faggots were thus bound together, that antagonized the womb of consciousness, and these polar twins should be continuously struggling. How, then, were they dissociated? I was so far in my reflections when, as I have said, a side light began to shine upon the subject of the laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it ever was yet been stated the trembling matterly, the mist-like transience of some seemingly so solid body in which we walk attired. Certain agents I found to have the power to shake the pluck back and fleshly vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion, for two good reasons. I will not enter deeply into the scientific branch of my confession, first because I have made to learn that the doom and burden of our life is bound forever on man's shoulders, and when the attempt is made to cast it off, but it returns upon us with more unfamiliar and awful pressure. Second, because, as my narrative will make, alas, too evident, my discoveries were incomplete. Enough, then, that I will not only be recognized by natural body from the mere aura and engulfance of certain of powers that made up my spirit, but managed to compound a drug by which these powders should not be dethroned from the supremacy, and the second form of encounter substituted, none the less natural to me because they were the expression, and bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul. I hesitated long before I put this theory to the test of practice. I well knew that I had risked death for any drug that was so potentially controlled and shook by fortress to identify by the least scruple of an overdose or at least inopportunity in the moment of exhibition, utterly blot out that immaterial abracadabra which I looked to it to change. But the temptation of a discovery so singular and profound that last overcame the suggestions of alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. I purchased at once, from a firm of wholesale chemists, a large quantity of a particular salt which I knew, from my experiments, to be the last ingredient required. The late one accursed night, I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when the illumination had subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion. The most racking pangs succeeded. A grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and horror of the spirit cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. Then these agonies began swiftly to subside. I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something incredibly new, and from this very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in the body, within a conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running through like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown and innocent a freedom of the soul. I knew myself, at the first breath of this new life, to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold to a slave to my original evil, and the thought in the moment braced into light and me in like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act, I suddenly was aware that I had lost us in stature. There was no mirror at that day in my room, that which that stands beside me as I write was brought there later on one and for the very purpose of these transformations. The night, however, was far gone into the morning. The morning, black as it was nearly ripe for conception of the day. The inmates of these houses were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber. I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, to venture in my new shape as far as my bedroom. I crossed the yard, whereas in the constellation looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder the first creature of that sort of the unsleeping vigilance, and had yet disclosed them. I stole through the corridors, the stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for my first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. I must here speak by theory alone, saying not that I which know, but that much I suppose to be most probable. The evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred by the stopping efficiency, was less robust and less developed than the good of which I had just deposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 of a life effort, virtue and control, it had been much less exercised and less exhausted, and hence, as I think of it, I came about it that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil besides, which I still must believe to be lethal, the lethal side of a man, had left on the body of an imprint, deformity, and decay. And yet I looked upon this ugly idol in the glass. I was a conscious man, of no repugnance, rather of a leap of welcome. This, too, was myself. It seemed natural and human. In my eyes it bore a livelier image of the spirit. It seemed more express and angle than the imperfect and divided countenance I had been hitherto accustomed to call mine, and so far I was doubtless right. I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde could come near to me at first without the visible misgiving of flesh. This, as I take it, was because all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled and good and evil, and Edward Hyde alone in the ranks of mankind was pure evil. I lingered but a moment at the mirror, and the second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted, and yet it remained to be seen as if I had lost my identity beyond redemption, and I must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine, and hurrying back in my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, the stature, the face of Henry Jekyll. That night I came to my fatal crossroads. I had approached my discovery in the more noble spirit. I had risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations. All must have been otherwise, and from the agonies of death and birth I have come forth an angel instead of a friend. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine. It had but shocked the doors of the prison house of my dispositions, and like the captives of Philippine, that which stood within ran forth, and that time thy virtue slumbered, my evil kept awake by my Hyde. Hence, although I had now two characters as well as two appearances, one was wholly evil, and the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. The movement was thus wholly toward the worse. Even at that time I had not conquered my aversions to the dryness of a life of study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and yet was my pleasures, to say at least, undignified, and I had not only well known and highly considered, but growing toward the elderly man. This coherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. It was on the side of that my new power tempted me until I fell into slavery. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of noted the professor, and to assume, like a thick collar, that of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the new notion. It seemed to me that the time to be humorous, and I made my preparations with that the most studious case. I took and furnished the house of Soho, and to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and engaged a housekeeper, a creature to whom I well knew to be silent, sculptress. On the other side, I announced to my servants that Mr. Hyde, whom I described, was to have a very full liberty and power about the house in the square, and the Perry mishaps. I even called and made myself a familiar object in the second character. The next I drew up to which you so object, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll could enter that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary loss. And thus fortified, as I supposed, on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of position. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. As I was thought first that ever so did for his pleasures, I was the first that could plod in his public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in the moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into a sea of liberty. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it, I did not even exist. I let me escaped into my laboratory door. Give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught I had always standing ready, and whatever had to be done, Edward Hyde would pass away like a stain of Beth upon a mirror, and there were his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study. A man who could afford laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. The pleasures which made haste to seek in my disguise, as we have undignified, would scare use a harder term, but the handle of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn toward the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I often plunged into kind of wonder that in my very vicarious depravity, this familiar that I called out on my own soul, I set forth alone to his own good pleasure. I was being inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centered on self, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another. Relentless like a man of stone, Henry Jekyll stood at times before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the situation was apart from ordinary laws, and indisputably relaxed the grasp of conscience. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone, that was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good quality seemingly unimpaired. He would make even haste, where it was possible to undo the evil done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Into the details of the infamy which I thus conceived, for now, and even now I can scarce grant that I committed it, I have no design of entering. I mean but to point out the warnings and successive steps with my characteristic approach. I met with one accident which, as brought on no consequence, I shall no more than mention. An act of cruelty to a child aroused such anger in me of a passer-by, whom I recognized on the other day in the passion of your kinsman. The doctor and the child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared for my life. At the last, in order to pacify this resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them in a check drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. But this danger was easily eliminated from furniture by opening an account at another bank and in Edward Hyde himself, and by sloping my own hand backward, I had supplied my double with signature. I thought I had sat beyond my reach of fate. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I had been out for one of my adventures, had returned at late an hour, and woke the next day with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain I looked about me. In vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square. In vain that I recognized the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame, something still insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but there in a little room in Soho where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself, and in my psychological way began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into the comfortable morning doze, as I was still so engaged, and when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eyes fell upon my hand. Now the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white, and comely, but the hand of which I now saw clearly enough in its yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on bedclothes, was lean, quarter-knuckly, and dusky pallor and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair, and it was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for nearly half a minute, sunk as I was in mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals, and bounding from my bed I rushed into the mirror. At the sight I met my own eyes. My blood was changed into something exquisitely and thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed, Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde. How has this to be explained? I asked myself, and then, with another bound of terror, how was this to be remedied? It was well on the morning. The servants were up. All my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the black passage, across the open court, through the anatomical theater, from where I was standing, horror struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but what was use of what, when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature, and when with an overpowering sweetness of a relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. Had I soon dressed as well as I was able, in clothes of my own size, had soon passed through my house, through the Bradshaw, stared and drew back, and seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour and such in strange array. Then, and 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll returned to his own shape and was sitting down, in the darkened brow, to make a faint breakfasting. Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my precious experience, seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall, to be spelling out the letters of my judgment, and I began to reflect on more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. This part of me which I had power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. It had seemed to me of late that though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though when I am wore that form, I were conscious and more generous tide of blood, and began to spy a danger that, if this was much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be prematurely overthrown, the power of voluntary change be forfeited, and character of Edward Hyde become invariably mine. The power of the drug had not always been equally displayed. Once, very early in my career, it had totally failed me, since I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once, with infinite risk of death, to treble in the amount, and these uncertainties had cast hit Harrow to the whole shadow of my contentment. Now, however, in the light of the morning's accident, I was led to the remark as a whereas. In the beginning, the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll. It had late gradually been decided, transferred itself to the other side. All things, therefore, seemed to point to this. That was I slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. Between these two, I now felt I had to choose. My two natures had memory in common, but the other faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, now was most sensitive apprehensions, now with a greedy gusto projected and shared the pleasures and adventures of Hyde, but Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern and which he conceals him from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die with those appetites which had secretly indulged and the late begun to pamper. The cast within Hyde was to die with 1,000 interests and aspirations, and to become at a blow and forever desired and friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in scales, for while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would not even be conscious of all that had been lost. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate were odd and commonplace as man. Such the same inducements and alarms cast the die for a tempted and trembling sinner, and it fell out of me, as it falls with so vast majority of my fellows, that I choose the better part found of wanting in the strength to keep it.
Yes, I preferred the elderly and discounted doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hope, and bade a resolute farewell to the liberty, the comparative youth, the light step, leaping impulses, and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in disguise of Hyde. I made this choice perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up in the house of Soho, nor destroyed the clothes of Edward Hyde, which still lay in my cabinet. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of an approving conscience. But time began to last to obliterate and the freshness of my alarm. The praises of conscience began to grow into a thing of course. I began to be tortured with throes and longings, as of Hyde struggling after freedom, and at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded the swallowed and transforming draught. I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons himself upon his vice, he is out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, well made enough allowance for complete moral insensibility and instant readiness to evil, which were leading characters of Edward Hyde. And yet it was by these that I was punished. My devil had long been caged. He came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. It must have been like this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul the tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare, at least, before God, no man morality sane could have been guilty of that crime so pitiful of provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that which a sick child may break a plaything. But I had involuntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts in which, even by the worst of it, continues to walk, with some edge of degree of some steadiness among temptations, and in my case, to be tempted, however slightly, was to fail. Instantly, the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged. With a transport of glee, I mauled an unresisting body, tasting the light of every blow, and it was until weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly, in the top of my fit of delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed. My life had to be forfeited, and fled from the scene of these excesses, at once glorying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified and stimulated. My love of life grew to the topmost peg. I ran to my house in Soho to make doubly sure, destroyed my tapers. Thence I set out through the lamplit streets, in the same divided ecstasy of my mind, gloating on my crime, light-headedly devising others in the future, and yet still hastening to hearkening in my wake for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had sung a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it, pledged the dead man. The Bang's transformation had not done but tearing him. Before Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fell upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to God. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot. I saw my life as a whole. I followed up the days of childhood when I walked in with my father's hand, and though the self-denying toils of my professional life were to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality at the damned horrors of the evening, I could have screamed aloud, which I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me. And still, between the petitions, my ugly face of iniquity stared into my soul. As the acuteness of the remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy, and the problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible. Whether I would or not, I was now confined to the better part of my existence, and oh, how I rejoiced to think of it! With what willing humility I embraced anew the restrictions of a natural life! With what sincere renunciation I locked the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. The next day came the news that the murder had been overlooked. The guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and the victim was a man high in public estimation. It was not only a crime, but it was a tragic folly. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses and thus but arrest and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now in my city of refuge. Let Hyde peep out in an instant, and all the hands of men would be raised to take and slay him. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past, and I can only say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful with some good. You know yourself and how earnestly, in the last month of the last year, I labored to relieve the suffering. You know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. Nor I can truly say that I wearied for this beneficent and innocent life. I think instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely, but more still cursed with my duality of purpose, and the first edge of my penitence wore off. The lower side of me, so long indulged, so recently chained down, began to growl for license. Not only I dreamed for resignating Hyde, the bare idea of it would startle me to a frenzy. No, it was my own person that was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience, and it was an ordinary secret sinner that fell last before the assaults of temptation. There comes an end to all things. The most capricious measure of is filled to at last, and this brief condensation to my evil finally destroyed balance of my soul. And yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day, wet underfoot where we had melted, but cloudless overhead, and the Regent's Park full of winter chirpings and sweet with spring odors. I sat in the sun on my bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory, a spiritual sigh, a little drowse, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbors. Then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active good will and with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at the very moment of that vanguardless thought, the qualm came over me, a horrid nausea and the most deadly shuddering. These passed away and left me faint. Then, as in the return faintness subsided, I began to be aware of change in of my thoughts, a greater boldness, a contempt of danger, the solution of the bond's obligation. I looked again. My clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs, and the hand that lay on my knee was cold, corded, and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. A moment before I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved, the clothes lay for me in the dining room at home, and now I was common quarry of mankind, hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thralled to the gallows. My reason wavered, but it did not fail me utterly. I have more than observed that what in my second character, these faculties seemed sharpened to the point that my spirits were intensely elastic. Thus I came about it, where Jekyll perhaps might have succumbed. Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. My drugs were one in the presses of the cabinet. How was I to teach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my head, I set myself to solve. The laboratory door I had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. I saw I must employ another hand, and thought of Lanyon. How was he to be reached? How persuaded? Supposing that I escaped the capture in the streets, how was I to make my way to his presence? How should I, an unknown and displeasing visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the study of his colleague, Dr. Jekyll? But I remembered that of my original character, one part remained of me. I could write in my own hand, and once I conceived that kindling spark, the way I must follow became lighted up from end to end. Thereupon, I arranged my clothes the best I could, and passing a hansom, drove over to a hotel in Portland Street, the name of which I chanced to remember. At my appearance, which was indeed comical enough, however tragic a fate of these garments covered, the driver could not conceal his mirth. I gnashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and then the smile withered upon his face, happily for him, yet more happily for myself, for in another instant I certainly dragged him from his perch. At the inn, as I entered, I looked about me with so black countenance as made the attendants tremble. I looked did they exchange in my presence, so obsequently took my orders, led me to a private room, and brought me wherewithal to write. Hyde, in danger of his life, was a creature new to me, shaken with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch for murder, lusting to inflict pain, yet the creature was a stature, mastered his fury with a great effort of the will, composed his 2 important letters, one to Lanyon and one to Poole, and that he might receive actual evidence of their being post, sent them with the directions that they should be registered. And thenceforth he sat all day over the fire in the private room, gnawing on his nails. There he dined, sitting alone with his fears, the waiter visibly quailing before his eyes, and thence, when the night was fully come, he set forth the corner and the closed tab, and was driven to and fro about the streets of the city. Here, I say, I cannot say. That child of hell had nothing human, nothing lived in him but fear and hatred, and when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured forth, attired in his misfitting clothes, an object marked out for observation, into the midst of the nocturnal passengers. These 2 base passions raged within him like a tempest. He walked fast, hunted by fears, chattering to himself, skulking through the less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minutes that he still divided him from midnight. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. I came to myself at Lanyon's. The horror of my old friend perhaps affected me somewhat. I do not know. It was at least but a drop into the sea of the abhorrences with which I looked upon these hours. A change came over me. There was no longer fear of the gallows. It was back the horror of being Hyde that racked me. I received Lanyon's condemnation partly in a dream. It was partly in a dream that I came to my home and my own home and got into bed. I slept after the procrastination of the day, with a stingiest and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrung me could even avail to break. I awoke in the morning shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I still feel hatred and feared the thought of the brute that slept within me. I had not of the course forgotten the appalling dangers of the day before, but I was once more at home, in my own home, close to my drugs, and my gratitude for my escape shone so strong in my soul that I almost rivaled brightness of hope. I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I seized again with those indescribable sensations. I heralded the change, and I had but the time to gain shelter of my cabinet. Therefore I was once again raging and freezing with the passions of Hyde. It took on this occasion of a double dose to recall myself, and at last, after 6 hours, as I sat looking sadly at the fire, the pangs returned, and the drug had re-administered. In short, from the day forth, it seemed only by a great effort as of gymnastics, and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug, that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. And all hours of day and night I would be taken with a premonitory shudder. After all, if I slept, or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it would always be as Hyde as I awakened. Under the strain of this continually impending doom, and by the sleepiness I had now condemned myself, even beyond what I had thought possible to man, I became, in my own person, a creature eaten up by emptied fever, legally weak both in the body and mind, and solely occupied one thought and the horror of my other self. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of transformation grew daily less marked, and into the possession of a fancy brimming images of terror, the soul boiling with a causeless hatred, and body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energies of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to have grown the sickliness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. With Jekyll, it was a thing of vital instinct. He had now seen the full deformity of that creature shared with some of the phenomena, the consciousness, and was cohere him to death. And these links of community, which themselves made most poignant part of distress, he thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as of something not only hellish but organic. This was the shocking thing, that the slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, that was dead and had no shape, should usurp the offices of life, and this again that was an insurgent horror was knit to him closer than a wife, closer than an eye, lay caged in flesh where he heard it mutter and felt it strangled to be born, and at every hour of weakness and in confidence of slumber prevailed against him and deposed him out of life. The hatred for Hyde and Jekyll of the different order, his terror of the gallows, drove him continually to commit the temporary suicide and return his subordinate station of part of the person, but he loathed the necessity, he loathed the desperancy into which Jekyll has now fallen, and as he resented the dislike with much of himself, he was himself regarded. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would now play me, scrawling in my own father, and indeed, but not for his fear of death. He would long ago have ruined himself in order to involve me in ruin, but his love of me is wonderful. I go further, who sicken and freeze at the mere thought of him. I recall the objection of passion of this attachment, and when I know how he fears my power to cut him off by suicide, I find it in my heart to pity him. It is useless. The time is awfully fails me. To prolong this description, no one has ever suffered such torments. Let it suffice, and yet even to these, habit brought, no, not avalation, but a certain calmness of the soul, a certain acquiescence of despair, and my punishment might have gone on for years, but for the last calmity which had now fallen, in which the finally severed me from my own face and nature, the provision salt which had never been renewed since the day of the first experiment began to run low. I sent out a fresh supply and mixed the draught. The ebullition flowed, and the first change of color, not the second, drank it and was without efficiency. You will learn from Poole that I have had London ransacked. I was in vain, and I am now persuaded that my first supply was impure, and that it was now unknown impurity which lent efficiency to the draught. About a week has passed, and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of that last and old powders. This, then, was at the last time, short of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think of his own thoughts or see his own face, and now how sadly altered in the glass. Now, nor must I delay too long or to bring my writing to an end, for if my narrative was hit harrow, escape destruction, has been my combination of great prudence and good luck should the throes of change take me the act of writing it. Hyde will tear it to pieces, but if some time shall have elapsed after I have laid it by, his wonderful selfishness and circumscription to the moment should probably save it once again from the action of his ape-like spite. And indeed, the doom that it is closing on us both has already changed and crushed him. Half an hour from now, I shall again and forever renew the hatred personality, and I now shall sit shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening, the pace up and down his room, my last earthly refuge, and give my ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold, or will he find the courage to release himself at the moment? God knows I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what has to follow his concerns another than myself. Here, then, as I lay down my pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end.